A single mother saved a millionaire buried alive in the woods. But what he whispered made them both. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. It was a cold autumn evening when Emily, a single mother of two, decided to take a walk in the woods behind her small house. The sun was setting, casting a pale orange glow through the trees. She had no particular reason to go out, other than the fact that she needed a moment to clear her mind. Her life had been a constant whirlwind of work, school runs, and late-night bills, and lately, she had been feeling as though she was losing herself in it all. As she walked through the forest, the rustling of the leaves under her boots was the only sound that filled the air. She had no idea how long she had been walking when she heard a faint sound, barely noticeable, as though someone was calling for help. At first, she thought it was just the wind or an animal in distress, but then it came again. A voice, weak but unmistakable, coming from somewhere deep within the woods. She froze for a moment, trying to figure out if her mind was playing tricks on her. But the voice was clear this time, a desperate whisper, and it seemed to be calling her name. She hesitated for just a second, then followed the sound, her heart pounding. The deeper she ventured, the more intense the voice became. It was faint at first, but as she got closer, the voice became clearer, full of pain and desperation. Her hands trembled as she pushed aside branches and brambles, finally stumbling upon a clearing. In the center of the clearing, half buried in the dirt, was a man. His body was pale, covered in mud and leaves, his clothes torn and soaked in blood. His eyes were barely open, and his breathing was shallow. Emily's heart skipped a beat as she rushed toward him, dropping to her knees. Beside him, "Oh my God," she gasped, her hands trembling as she reached out to him. "What happened to you?" The man groaned, barely able to lift his head. His voice was weak, but there was a sense of urgency in his tone. "Please help me." Emily looked around in panic. She had no idea who this man was or how he had ended up buried in the woods like this, but she couldn't leave him there. She needed to help. She struggled to pull him free from the dirt, her muscles aching with the effort, but finally, after what felt like an eternity, she managed to drag him to safety. Once he was out of the dirt, she checked his pulse, relieved to find he was still alive, though barely. She looked around, but there was no one else in sight. The woods were eerily quiet, and the only thing she could hear was the sound of her own breath. "You're safe now," she whispered, trying to comfort him, though she had no idea what had happened to him or who he was. As she gently cradled his head in her lap, the man's eyes fluttered open for a moment, and he whispered something barely audible. "Don't tell anyone about me." Emily's confusion deepened as she stared at him, but before she could ask more, his eyes closed again, and he slipped into unconsciousness. What had he meant by that? Why had he been buried alive in the woods? Who was he? And why was he asking her not to tell anyone about him? These were the questions that would haunt her for the days to come. As she carried him back to her home, she couldn't help but feel the weight of the mystery pressing down on her. Little did she know, this encounter would change her life forever, in ways she could never have imagined. Emily sat beside the man she had just pulled from the dirt, his head resting gently in her lap. The faint scent of earth and blood clung to his clothes, and the quiet of the woods seemed to echo the haunting words he had whispered. "Don't tell anyone about me." She shivered slightly, unsure of what to make of his cryptic plea. She had no idea who he was, why he had been buried alive, or why he had asked her to keep his presence a secret. But in that moment, all that mattered was that she had to get him to safety. She couldn't just leave him here in the woods, alone, on the brink of death. As the minutes passed, Emily carefully gathered him in her arms, her muscles aching from the effort, and began the long walk back to her home. The walk felt longer than it should have, the weight of the man in her arms making her heart race with worry. The autumn night had fallen quickly, and the path home was dark, the only light coming from the dim glow of the moon filtering through the trees. As she trudged forward, she couldn't help but wonder who this man was. Was he someone dangerous? Had he been hurt by someone? And why, of all people, had he ended up in her path, in the woods, buried alive? Her mind raced with questions, But she didn't have answers, not yet. When she finally made it back to her small house, she carefully laid him on her couch, making sure he was comfortable as best as she could manage. Emily's small home, filled with the scent of fresh laundry and the warmth of the kitchen, felt like a sanctuary compared to the harsh wilderness she had just left behind. She quickly grabbed a blanket, covering him with it as she gently wiped away the dirt and blood from his face. His skin was pale, but there was a faint warmth to him, indicating that he was still alive, though barely. As she worked, Emily tried to piece together what little she knew about him. His clothes, torn and stained, seemed expensive, though they were now a far cry from their original state. His face, though battered, had a certain familiarity to it, though she couldn't place where she had seen him before. She checked his pulse again, relieved to find that it was steady, though weak. His breathing, too, seemed to stabilize as the minutes passed. Emily was used to caring for people, especially since becoming a single mother, but this was different. This man was not just a stranger. He was someone with a story that she couldn't even begin to understand. She couldn't shake the feeling that his life, and whatever had brought him to that moment, was somehow tied to hers now. She had always believed that things happened for a reason, but this was more than just a coincidence. After what felt like hours, the man stirred slightly, his eyelids fluttering as he slowly regained consciousness. Emily was on alert, sitting at the edge of the couch, ready to assist if needed. His eyes opened, but they were unfocused, glazed over with confusion. He blinked a few times, as if trying to make sense of his surroundings. Slowly, his gaze landed on her, and his lips parted. Who are you?" His voice was hoarse, barely more than a whisper. "I'm Emily," she said softly, offering him a reassuring smile. "I found you in the woods. You were buried alive." The man's eyes widened, and he struggled to sit up, but his body was too weak. Emily gently pushed him back down, careful not to cause him any more discomfort. "You need to rest," she said, her voice steady. "You've been through something terrible. I'm just here to help." He looked at her for a long moment, confusion still evident in his eyes. Why would you help me?" he asked, his voice still weak, but laced with disbelief. Emily hesitated, unsure of how to answer. She wasn't sure why she had helped him. It was instinct, pure and simple. "Because you needed help," she replied simply. "And I couldn't just leave you there." There was a long pause before he finally spoke again, his voice trembling. "Don't tell anyone about me," he whispered. "Please." Emily frowned slightly, unsure of what to make of his request. "What do you mean?" she asked, her curiosity piqued. "Who are you?" He closed his eyes, as if trying to shut out the pain that was still very much present. "I can't explain right now," he said, his voice barely audible. "Just promise me you won't tell anyone." Emily's heart clenched at the desperation in his voice, but she nodded slowly. "I won't tell anyone," she said, though she wasn't sure she could keep that promise. After all, this man was a mystery, and mysteries always had a way of unraveling. Over the next few days, Emily tended to him as best as she could. She made sure he ate, kept his fluids up, and gave him the space he needed to recover. But as much as she cared for him, she still didn't know anything about him. He never spoke about his past, and when she asked, he would always change the subject, as though afraid to reveal too much. But Emily was determined to help him. She couldn't just let him slip away, not after everything she had done to save him. She kept a close watch on him, though she couldn't shake the feeling that something more was going on beneath the surface. There was a tension between them, a bond that neither of them fully understood yet, but it was growing. As the days passed, Emily found herself thinking more and more about him, wondering if his past would ever come to light. And what would happen if it did? What if he wasn't just any ordinary man, but someone important, someone with a dangerous secret? Would she be putting herself and her children at risk by keeping him in her home? Or was she simply doing the right thing, helping a man in need, without expecting anything in return? One thing was certain. Emily's life had changed the moment she found him buried alive in the woods. And whatever came next, she knew she couldn't turn back now. It had been 3 days since Emily had found the man in the woods, and despite her efforts to care for him, she still didn't know much about him. He had been barely conscious when she found him, but now he was awake, and his condition was improving, though slowly. He would not talk much, but each time Emily asked him about his past, his eyes would darken, and he would change the subject. His silence was heavy, filled with secrets he seemed desperate to keep hidden. Emily didn't press him. She respected his space, but her curiosity kept growing, as did her concern for him. She found herself thinking about him more often than she should have. She knew she should have been focused on her children, on making sure they were okay, but something about this man kept drawing her in. He wasn't just anyone. He was a mystery, and mysteries were something Emily couldn't ignore. The man had been buried alive. He had clearly been through something unimaginable, but what? And why had he been left to die in such a brutal way? The questions swirled in her mind, but the answers never came. She had no choice but to let time take its course. Her kids had been curious, of course. Emily had told them that the man was a friend she was helping, someone who had been hurt and needed a place to stay. But her daughter, Lily, a sharp 8-year-old with bright eyes and a never-ending stream of questions, had asked more than once why he seemed so familiar. "I've seen him on the news, Mom," she said one night, glancing at the man as he sat quietly on the couch, staring out the window. "He looks like that billionaire, you know, the one who went missing last year." Emily's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't thought of that. Could it really be him? Was he the man her daughter was talking about? The man who had disappeared after a car accident? The one everyone had assumed was dead? She hadn't connected the dots, but now that Lily mentioned it, the man's features were starting to ring a bell. His sharp jawline, his dark hair, and the way he held himself. There was something about him that made him look different from the ordinary man she had helped, something that now seemed eerily familiar. But if he was really the billionaire who had gone missing, why was he here, in her home, hiding away from the world? Emily didn't have time to think about it. Her mind was too busy with the demands of motherhood. But as the days passed, the man's presence became more difficult to ignore. He spent his days resting, though he would sometimes take walks around her property, always keeping to himself, never speaking much. Emily kept an eye on him, but she didn't press him. He needed time to heal, and she was determined to help him, no matter the cost. But things began to change when one night, Emily woke up to the sound of a phone ringing. It was late, almost 2 a.m. She groggily rolled out of bed, careful not to wake the children, and stumbled toward the living room. The phone, her only landline, sat on the coffee table. She picked it up, unsure of who could be calling at this hour. "Hello," she said, her voice still thick with sleep. "Is this Emily?" The voice on the other end was unfamiliar, low, and professional. "Yes," she replied, her heart beginning to race. "Who is this?" There was a pause on the other end of the line before the voice spoke again. "This is Detective Harris from the Westbridge Police Department. I need to speak with you about a man named Grant Carter. He's been found, and we believe he may have been staying with you. Can you confirm that?" Emily's stomach dropped. She almost dropped the phone in shock, but she managed to hold it tightly, her mind spinning. "Grant Carter?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. The name struck her like a bolt of lightning. It was him, the missing billionaire, the man she had been taking care of. Emily was stunned, unsure of what to say. "Yes, that's correct," the detective continued. "We need to know where he is and if he's still with you. It's important." Emily's mind raced as she tried to think of a response. She had no idea what to do. If this man was really Grant Carter, then everything had just changed. She had no idea how to handle this. The detective continued to speak, but Emily wasn't listening anymore. All she could think about was the man in her living room. The man who had been buried alive. The man who had somehow become a part of her life. She didn't know what was real anymore, what to believe. She didn't know who she could trust. "Emily," the detective's voice broke through her thoughts, pulling her back into reality. "Can you answer me?" "Yes," she replied quickly, forcing herself to focus. "He's here. He's staying with me. But I don't understand. What's going on? What happened to him?" The detective was silent for a moment before speaking again. "We need to speak with him. We believe he's in danger. His life may still be at risk." Emily's heart raced as fear began to flood her system. "In danger?" she repeated, her voice trembling. "What do you mean?" "I'm afraid there's a lot you don't know, Emily. And you're in danger too, just by being near him. I need you to listen carefully. Can you get him to talk to us? Can you get him to trust you?" The words hit Emily like a punch in the gut. She had no idea what she was dealing with. She had thought she was helping a man in need, but now it seemed like she had unknowingly become tangled up in something much larger than herself. Something dangerous. "I'll do whatever I can," Emily said, her voice filled with determination, though her heart was still pounding in her chest. "But you need to tell me what's going on. What happened to him? Why was he buried alive?" There was another long pause, and then the detective spoke again, his tone grim. "It's complicated, and I'm afraid it's only going to get worse from here. But we'll explain everything when we can. For now, you need to stay safe. Don't let him out of your sight." Emily nodded, though the detective couldn't see her. "I will," she said, though she wasn't sure how to keep that promise. She didn't know what was coming next, but she knew that everything had just changed, and she was scared. Emily sat in her kitchen, the phone still pressed tightly against her ear. The words the detective had spoken echoed in her mind, over and over again. "You're in danger too, just by being near him. We need you to get him to talk to us." Her hands shook slightly as she lowered the phone, her thoughts racing. The man she had been helping, Grant Carter, the missing billionaire, was wrapped in mystery. She had tried to keep him safe, to help him heal, but now it seemed like she had unknowingly stepped into a much larger and much darker story than she had anticipated. The detective's warning weighed heavily on her. He had been vague, but the implication was clear. Grant wasn't just a victim in need of help. He was part of something dangerous, something that could put Emily and her children at risk. She looked at the clock, its steady ticking only increasing her sense of urgency. The night had fallen quiet, and the only sounds were the occasional rustling of the trees outside and the soft hum of the refrigerator. It was peaceful, but in the pit of her stomach, Emily felt anything but calm. She needed to figure out what was going on, and she needed to do it quickly. She stood up, pacing the small kitchen, the weight of her responsibilities bearing down on her. She had promised the detective she would keep Grant safe, but she had no idea what she was dealing with. She hadn't even asked herself how Grant had ended up in the woods, buried and on the brink of death. She couldn't put the pieces together. Her thoughts drifted back to the man on her couch. He had been quiet since that night when the detective had called. His silence was deeper now, like something had changed in him. Every time Emily asked him a question, he deflected, speaking in vague terms, hiding behind layers of mystery. But Emily knew she couldn't let it go on forever. She needed answers. She needed to know the truth. Taking a deep breath, she made her decision. She had to confront him. Emily walked into the living room, where Grant was sitting by the window, staring out into the darkness. He didn't notice her approach at first, his mind clearly somewhere far away. She hesitated for a moment, but then, gathering her courage, she sat down next to him. "Grant," she said softly, her voice steady but filled with concern. He turned toward her, his tired eyes meeting hers, though his expression remained unreadable. "What happened to you?" Emily asked, her heart pounding in her chest. "Why were you buried alive?" His eyes flickered for just a moment, but then he turned away, staring out the window again. He was avoiding the question, and Emily could feel the tension in the air. "I can't talk about it," he muttered, his voice barely a whisper. "It's too dangerous." His words only deepened the mystery. "Dangerous?" Emily repeated, her voice filled with confusion and frustration. "What do you mean? What's going on?" He didn't respond, and for a moment, Emily thought he might not say anything at all. But then, slowly, he spoke, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "They're looking for me," he said, his voice low. "The people who did this to me. They'll come after anyone who helps me. I'm not safe, and neither are you." Emily's heart sank as she listened to his words. She had been trying so hard to help him, but now it seemed like she had walked into a situation far beyond her control. She had always believed she could handle anything life threw her way, but this was different. She was in over her head. "Who are they?" she asked, her voice shaking slightly. "What do they want from you?" Grant took a deep breath, his face pale as he ran a hand through his hair. "I was involved in something I shouldn't have been. A business deal gone wrong. People got hurt, and now they want me to pay for it." Emily sat back, trying to process his words. She had heard about corrupt businessmen, shady deals, and dangerous power struggles, but she never imagined she would find herself in the middle of one. "But why me?" she asked, almost too softly. "Why did you end up here with me?" Grant looked at her for a long moment, his eyes filled with a mixture of guilt and sadness. "I didn't have a choice," he said quietly. "I knew I was running out of time, and I had nowhere else to go. I saw how you cared for your family, how you were willing to help a stranger. I thought maybe you could help me too." Emily felt a pang of sympathy for him. but it was quickly replaced by a growing sense of fear. She had brought him into her home, helped him recover, and now she was learning that he was tangled in something far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What do we do?" Grant took a deep breath, his eyes darkening as he looked toward the door. "We have to leave," he said, his voice firm now. "We have to get out of here, before they find us." Emily's stomach tightened at the thought of leaving, but she knew he was right. Staying here would put her and her children at risk. They had to leave, but where would they go? And who could they trust? Emily felt a surge of fear and uncertainty, but she pushed it down. She had made it this far, and she wasn't about to give up now. "We'll leave tonight," she said, her voice filled with determination. "I'll figure it out. I'll protect my family. You're not alone in this." Grant looked at her, his expression softening for the first time since she had met him. "Thank you," he said, his voice sincere. "I don't deserve your help, but I'll do whatever it takes to make sure you're safe." As the night stretched on, Emily prepared to leave. She packed what little they could take with them, trying to stay calm, but inside, her mind was racing. She had no idea what the future held, but one thing was certain, her life would never be the same again. And whatever danger lay ahead, she would face it head-on, for her family, for herself, and for the man who had somehow found his way into her life. The next few hours passed in a blur of tension and hurried decisions. Emily packed as quickly as she could, her mind racing with the urgency of their situation. The children were still asleep, oblivious to the danger creeping closer to their home. Her heart pounded in her chest as she moved through the house, collecting whatever she could: clothes, some cash, a few important documents, anything that might help them once they were on the run. Grant had insisted that they leave immediately, that staying in one place any longer would put them all in danger. The detective's warning echoed in her ears, reminding her that she wasn't just protecting herself, but her children, too. She had promised to keep them safe, and she intended to keep that promise. But what kind of life was this? What kind of future could they have if they were always looking over their shoulders? She glanced over at Grant, who was sitting silently on the couch, his eyes lost in thought. His features were still sharp, his expression distant, as if he was trapped in a world of memories he couldn't escape. The man who had come into her life so suddenly was now a stranger in many ways, someone with a dangerous past she didn't fully understand. He had been buried alive. Why? What had he done to deserve that fate? And why was he asking her to keep his identity a secret? The questions only multiplied, but there were no answers yet. Emily didn't know what was worse, the silence between them, or the fact that she had no idea who to trust anymore. But she couldn't focus on that now. They had to leave. She had to get her family out before it was too late. With her bag packed and everything ready to go, Emily woke her children. They were groggy at first, but she explained that they needed to leave for a little while, just a short trip to somewhere safe. The lie stung, but there was no other way to explain it. Her daughter, Lily, still half asleep, didn't ask too many questions, though she gave Grant a curious look as they hurried out the door. Emily didn't have time to explain. They had to move fast. The sun had just begun to rise as they climbed into the old SUV. The engine roared to life, and Emily glanced in the rearview mirror, her stomach tight. It was time to leave everything behind. The woods, the small house, the life she had known. Everything was now a distant memory. Emily had no clear destination in mind. She had to get them as far away as possible, but she didn't know where to go. The world seemed so much bigger now, filled with dangers she hadn't realized were lurking around every corner. But she couldn't turn back. She had made her decision. As she drove down the quiet highway, her thoughts kept drifting back to Grant. He was sitting silently in the passenger seat, his eyes scanning the horizon, distant and withdrawn. She had tried to ask him more about what had happened to him, but he had shut down, refusing to share any more details. "I can't explain," he had told her earlier. "It's too dangerous." Emily didn't push him further, but his words haunted her. What had he gotten involved in? What was so terrible that he couldn't talk about it? And more importantly, why had he chosen her of all people to help him? She couldn't help but wonder if he had ulterior motives. Maybe he was using her. Maybe he was just looking for a way to hide from the people who were after him. But somehow, deep down, she didn't believe that. There was something in the way he looked at her, the way he thanked her for helping him. She had seen enough of the world to recognize when someone was being genuine. But even with that, doubt still crept into her mind. It was hard to shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every car that passed by, every shadow in the distance, made Emily's heart race. She tried to focus on the road, to block out the thoughts that kept swirling in her head, but it was impossible. They were in this together now, and whatever came next, she would have to face it with him, and with her children. But as the miles stretched on, Emily began to feel the weight of their situation pressing down on her. They had nowhere to go. They couldn't stay in hotels. They were too exposed. They couldn't go to family or friends. She couldn't risk putting anyone else in danger. Emily knew they would have to keep moving, staying one step ahead of whatever was hunting them. But how long could they keep this up? How long could they run before the truth caught up with them? She glanced at Grant again. He looked like a man who had lived 1,000 lifetimes, someone who had seen the worst of the world and had somehow survived. But even he seemed unsure of what to do next. He was hiding from something, or someone, but Emily wasn't sure what that something was. And as much as she wanted to ask, she knew it wasn't the right time. She needed to stay focused. She needed to get them all to safety. But where? Grant finally broke the silence, his voice quiet and strained. "We can't keep running forever," he said, his words cutting through the tension. Emily glanced at him, her grip tightening on the steering wheel. "I know," she said, her voice soft but resolute. "But we'll figure it out, one step at a time." She didn't know how they would survive this, how they would get out of the mess they had found themselves in. But she was determined to keep going. For her children, for herself, and for the man who had somehow come into her life at the worst possible moment, but who had also become a part of her family. As they drove farther into the unknown, Emily knew one thing for certain. Their lives would never be the same. But she would do whatever it took to make sure they came out the other side of this alive. Emily continued to drive, the steady hum of the engine providing a comforting rhythm in the tense silence that had settled in the car. The world outside seemed to blur as they passed through small towns and open fields, the roads empty except for the occasional passing vehicle. Grant sat in the passenger seat, his eyes scanning the road ahead, but never fully focusing on anything. He was lost in his thoughts, a place where Emily couldn't follow. She hadn't expected any of this. A few days ago, her life had been simple, demanding, yes, but simple. Now, it was a constant game of running and hiding, of wondering when the next threat would arrive. She glanced over at Grant, trying to get a sense of his mind, but he remained as distant as ever, his face a mask of concern and fatigue. She had done everything she could to keep him safe, to protect her family, but now she was beginning to wonder if she was in over her head. The detective's words rang in her ears. "You're in danger too, just by being near him." How had she gotten here? How had she gone from helping a stranger to running from shadowy figures in the night? And what would happen if the people who were after Grant found her? She had made promises to herself and to her children that she would keep them safe. But every passing mile felt like one step closer to breaking that promise. She needed answers. The uncertainty was driving her mad. After what felt like hours, Emily made the decision to stop at a small diner on the edge of a sleepy town. The neon sign flickered in the dusk light, its glow casting a warm, inviting light on the cracked pavement. It looked like the kind of place where no one would ask questions, where they could blend in for a little while. Emily pulled into the parking lot, and for the first time since they had left, Grant spoke. "This isn't a good idea." His voice was low, almost like a warning. Emily turned to him, her brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice a mix of confusion and frustration. Grant's eyes met hers, his expression hardening. "They'll be looking for us. We can't stay in one place for long. You're putting yourself at risk just by stopping here." Emily took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. She understood the urgency, but at the same time, she needed a break. They couldn't keep running forever. She needed to gather her thoughts. "We're just getting something to eat," she said, her voice steady. "We'll be in and out. I'll keep an eye out. We won't stay long." Grant stared at her for a moment, his face unreadable. Then, with a resigned sigh, he nodded. "All right," he said, though the reluctance in his voice was clear. Emily reached over and touched his arm lightly. "I promise we won't stay long." He didn't respond, but she could feel the weight of his thoughts pressing down on him. The unease in his posture told her everything. He was scared. They both were. But she couldn't let fear control them. Not now. The diner was small and worn, the kind of place that had seen better days but still managed to stay open, offering warm meals to the occasional traveler. Emily pushed open the door, the bell above it jingling softly. The smell of greasy food and coffee filled the air, and the low murmur of conversation from the few patrons inside gave the place an almost comforting atmosphere. A waitress, middle-aged with a tired smile, looked up from behind the counter. "Sit wherever you like," she said, motioning toward the empty booths. Emily nodded and led Grant to a booth near the back, as far from the door as she could. She didn't want anyone seeing them too closely. They needed to be careful. The waitress brought the menus, and Emily immediately started scanning the items. She wasn't hungry, but she needed something to keep herself busy, to keep her mind from spiraling. She was already thinking about the next steps, about how long they could stay in the diner, when the waitress came back to take their order. Grant didn't look up when she asked for their selections. Emily ordered a coffee and a simple sandwich, but Grant merely shook his head. "Not hungry," he muttered. Emily didn't press him. She could tell he wasn't in the mood for food or small talk. She'd seen that look before, when someone was carrying a heavy burden that they couldn't share. As they waited, Emily's mind wandered back to the conversation with the detective. He had asked her to get Grant to talk, to get him to trust her enough to open up. But Grant had been closed off from the start, and she wasn't sure how much longer she could keep up the charade. She needed him to open up. She needed to understand what had happened, what kind of world she had walked into. She needed to know how deep the danger went. "Grant," she said softly, breaking the silence between them. He glanced up at her, his eyes tired but sharp. "I know you don't want to talk about it," she continued, her voice steady. "But I need to know. What's really going on?" For a long moment, Grant said nothing. Emily felt. Her heart began to race as the seconds stretched into uncomfortable silence. And then, finally, he spoke. "I told you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's not just about me. It's about them. The people who did this, they don't stop. And they won't stop until they've destroyed everything." Emily felt a chill run down her spine. "Who are they?" she asked, her voice trembling despite herself. Grant met her gaze, his face hardening with an emotion she couldn't quite place. "People who'll stop at nothing to get what they want," he said quietly. "People who don't care who they hurt along the way." Emily felt a wave of fear wash over her. The man she had taken into her home, the man she had fought to save, was now telling her that he was part of something much darker than she had ever imagined. And now, they were all caught up in it. She felt trapped, unsure of what to do next. But one thing was clear. They could never go back to the way things were. Whatever came next, it was going to change everything. And she wasn't sure if she was ready for it. The tension inside the small diner was palpable. As Emily sat across from Grant, the reality of their situation began to settle in. The clock on the wall ticked away the minutes, each one that passed a reminder of how little time they had. Grant's words still echoed in her mind. They don't stop. And they won't stop until they've destroyed everything. She tried to push the fear out of her mind, focusing on the present, but the anxiety was becoming overwhelming. She had no idea who these people were, but it was clear they were dangerous. Emily had always lived a simple life, working hard to provide for her children, keeping her head down, and staying out of trouble. But this was something else entirely. She had unwittingly stepped into a world of violence, secrets, and threats that she could barely comprehend. And now, her children were part of it too. She couldn't bear the thought of them being harmed because of her choices. As Emily sat in the booth, she felt her resolve harden. She couldn't let fear control her. She had to keep moving forward. For her children, for herself, and for Grant. She needed to find a way out, but the question remained, where? Emily took a deep breath and looked around the diner once more. The waitress was still busy behind the counter, glancing over occasionally, but they seemed to be the only patrons at this late hour. The diner felt too quiet, as if the world outside had disappeared. The thought of them being watched made Emily's skin crawl. She wanted to move, to keep going, but Grant's warning kept repeating in her mind. "They're looking for us." But what exactly did that mean? Were these people just hunting him down, or was there something more to it? Grant had said he was involved in something that had gone wrong, but the details were still unclear. Who were these people? What exactly did he do to put them in danger? She needed answers, but every time she asked, Grant clammed up. She understood his hesitation. The man was clearly running from something, hiding from a past that was catching up to him. But Emily couldn't live with this uncertainty for much longer. She couldn't live like this, in constant fear, constantly on the run. We can't stay here long. Grant's voice broke through her thoughts. He had been staring out the window, but now his eyes met hers, his expression grim. They could be anywhere. We need to keep moving. Emily nodded, her fingers gripping the edge of the table. Her heart was racing. She didn't know what to do next, but she couldn't stay here. Not with her children in tow. Let's go, she said, her voice firm. She slid out of the booth, and Grant followed suit. As they made their way to the door, Emily's mind raced. She had no plan, no place to go, but she couldn't stay here. Not with him. Not with the danger looming over them. Once outside, the cold air hit her face, and she shivered, pulling her jacket tighter around her. She glanced over at Grant, who was already looking around, his eyes scanning the area. We need to get off the main roads, he muttered. It's too easy for them to find us if we stay visible. Emily agreed, nodding in silence. The headlights from the diner illuminated the road ahead, but she knew it wouldn't take long for someone to spot them. They walked quickly, heading toward the SUV. Emily's hand trembled slightly as she reached for the door, but she managed to steady herself. She was used to taking care of things, used to keeping her family safe, but this was different. The fear was real now. There was no escaping it. As she started the engine and pulled out of the parking lot, Grant spoke again, his voice low and urgent. We need to find a place to lay low. Somewhere they won't think to look for us. Emily nodded, gripping the steering wheel. She had no idea where that place was, but she knew they couldn't keep driving forever. They needed a plan. There's a motel up ahead, Emily said, pointing to the sign in the distance. It was small and unassuming, the kind of place that didn't attract much attention. But was it enough? She had no idea, but it was a start. She turned the car in that direction, trying to steady her breathing. The weight of everything was pressing down on her. She didn't know what was waiting for them, but she knew one thing for sure. She couldn't let her children's future be defined by fear. As she drove, Emily glanced at Grant again. He had his gaze fixed on the road ahead, his jaw clenched. She could feel the tension between them, the unspoken weight of everything they were facing. They were both in this together now. And as much as she wanted answers, as much as she needed to know what was going on, she couldn't push him too hard. She couldn't afford to alienate the only person who might have the answers. When they reached the motel, Emily parked the SUV and turned off the engine. She looked at Grant, who nodded slightly, his face unreadable. Let's do this, he said. Emily stepped out of the car, her feet hitting the pavement with a quiet thud. The night air was cold and still, the world around them silent. They approached the small building, their footsteps the only sound breaking the quiet. The manager, a gruff-looking man in his late 50s, eyed them as they walked through the door, but didn't say anything. Emily paid for a room with the cash she had on hand, and they made their way down the narrow hallway to their door. Inside the room, Emily quickly locked the door behind them. It wasn't much, just a small bed, a worn desk, and a flickering TV, but it would have to do for now. She turned to Grant, her heart still racing. What now? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Grant exhaled slowly, his eyes dark with worry. Now we wait. We stay quiet. And we figure out how to fix this. Emily didn't like the sound of that. They were trapped in a cycle, one they couldn't escape from without facing the danger head-on. But for now, this was all they could do. Stay hidden. Stay safe. Tomorrow, Emily said, her voice steady. Tomorrow, we figure out our next move. Grant didn't say anything, but he nodded. In the stillness of the room, they both knew that whatever came next, they had no choice but to face it together. The night was eerily quiet in the motel room, the hum of the air conditioner the only sound breaking the silence. Emily sat on the edge of the bed, her mind still racing after everything that had happened. She glanced over at Grant, who was sitting in the corner of the room, his back against the wall, his eyes lost in thought. They hadn't spoken much since they had arrived, each of them processing the overwhelming reality of their situation in their own way. Emily couldn't shake the sense of unease that had settled over her. They were safe for now, hidden away in a rundown motel room far from their previous lives. But for how long? She had no idea where they could go from here. They couldn't stay in one place for too long. The people who were after Grant, whoever they were likely already looking for them. The detective's warning echoed in her mind. They won't stop until they've destroyed everything. Emily closed her eyes for a moment, trying to clear her thoughts. She couldn't let herself fall apart. Not now. She had children to protect, and she had promised herself that she would get them out of this alive. But how? How did she protect her family from something she couldn't even understand? A knock on the door startled her, and she jumped up immediately, her heart pounding in her chest. Grant was already on his feet, his posture tense. Emily motioned for him to stay back, moving toward the door cautiously. She peered through the peephole, seeing nothing but the shadow of someone standing outside. Her breath hitched as she turned to Grant, who had already made his way to the corner of the room, his eyes narrowed. Was it them? The thought alone sent a chill down her spine. She couldn't risk opening the door. It could be anyone, the wrong person, and if they knew who she was helping, it could all end here. Stay down, she whispered to Grant. Don't make a sound. Grant nodded, his face unreadable. Emily hesitated, her hand on the doorknob, but then she took a deep breath and slowly stepped away from the door. The knock came again, more urgent this time. Her heart was pounding in her chest, and she found herself standing there frozen, unsure of what to do. Who was it? The thought twisted in her mind, and she stepped back toward the window, peering through the blinds. The figure outside hadn't moved, but Emily couldn't see their face. Her pulse raced as the seconds dragged on, feeling like an eternity. Finally, after what seemed like an endless wait, the knocking stopped. Emily exhaled shakily, the tension in her body easing just a fraction. She stepped away from the window and glanced at Grant. It's not them, she said quietly, though she didn't feel certain. She couldn't take any chances. After a few more moments of silence, she moved back toward the door, but this time she took a quick glance through the peephole. This time, there was no shadow, no sign of movement. Emily hesitated, but then turned the lock and opened the door just enough to peek outside. The hallway was empty. She let out a sigh of relief, but didn't open the door completely. Whoever had been knocking was long gone. She stepped back into the room, locking the door again. We can't stay here, she said, her voice low. They could be anywhere. We have to move. Grant looked at her, his gaze intense. You're right. We're not safe here. Emily's mind was already working, running through the options in her head. They couldn't stay in one place for too long. They had to keep moving. But where would they go? And how would they get there without being found? The uncertainty was unbearable. As Emily stared out of the small window in the room, the weight of everything she had taken on pressed down on her even more. What had she gotten herself into? What kind of future could they have now that everything had changed? I'll figure it out, she whispered to herself, her hand gripping the window sill as if it could ground her. I'll figure it out. She didn't know how, but she would. The quiet sound of her own voice steadied her for a moment. We'll leave tomorrow, she said to Grant, turning to face him. We'll head north. Far away from here. North. Grant raised an eyebrow. You think they won't follow us? Emily shrugged. I don't know, but we can't stay here. If we keep moving, maybe we can lose them, at least for a while. Grant seemed to consider this for a moment before nodding. All right, we'll go wherever you think is safest. Emily met his gaze and nodded firmly. She couldn't afford to doubt herself now. Thank you, she said quietly, grateful for his trust, even if they had just met, even if everything was uncertain. But we need to be smart about this. We'll travel by back roads. Keep low. Don't draw attention. Grant's lips pressed into a thin line, but he nodded again. I understand. We'll do it your way. I won't let anything happen to you, Emily added, her voice firm. She meant it, no matter the cost. They were in this together. Grant didn't say anything in response. Instead, he sat down at the small table by the window, his eyes fixed on the outside world, his posture tense as though he was still listening for any sign of danger. Emily turned back to the window herself, her mind spinning with plans and doubts. She had no idea what was coming next, but she couldn't stop now. She couldn't afford to. The next morning, they would leave. They would find a way to outrun the danger. Or at least, that was the plan. It was the only plan she had. The alternative, sitting and waiting to be found, wasn't an option. Not anymore. As she sat down beside Grant, she felt the weight of the night settling over her, the fear and uncertainty pressing in on all sides. But she wasn't alone. She had her children to protect. And she had Grant, for whatever he was worth. She had to keep moving forward. There was no other choice. The morning came too quickly, the first rays of sunlight slipping through the curtains. of their small motel room. Emily woke up with a start, her mind immediately returning to the weight of the decisions that lay ahead. She glanced at Grant, who was still asleep in the chair by the window, his face drawn with exhaustion. His deep breathing was the only sound in the room, but it was enough to remind her that they were still safe, for now. Emily took a deep breath, trying to calm herself. There was no time to waste. They needed to leave before anyone could find them. They had stayed hidden long enough, but Emily knew that the longer they remained in one place, the more dangerous it became. She couldn't risk putting her children in more danger. They had to keep moving. She sat up slowly, careful not to wake Grant just yet. Her fingers brushed the papers she had packed last night. Her children's school records, some cash she had managed to hold on to, and the few possessions she had kept for years. These small things were now the only anchors to her old life. She had to remind herself that, no matter how difficult it felt, she had to keep going. She had no choice. After a few minutes of quiet reflection, Emily stood up and went to the bathroom, splashing cold water on her face. It helped clear her mind, but the anxiety still gnawed at her. What was waiting for them? The detective's cryptic warning about the people after Grant echoed in her mind. They don't stop. They won't stop until they've destroyed everything. Her hands gripped the sink as she steadied herself. She couldn't let fear paralyze her now. Not when she had her children to protect. Not when Grant, a man she barely knew, was depending on her. She walked back into the room and saw Grant stirring in the chair. He looked up at her, his eyes tired, but there was a sense of resolve in them now. He knew what had to be done. "Morning," Emily said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We're leaving soon. We need to move." He nodded, his expression somber. "I know," he said. "I've been thinking about where we can go. It's risky, but we need to get as far away as possible." Emily raised an eyebrow. "Where?" "There's a small cabin in the woods," Grant explained, his voice low. "It belongs to someone I used to know. It's isolated, far from the nearest town. We can lay low there until we figure out what to do next." Emily hesitated for a moment. "Is it safe?" Grant looked her in the eye, his gaze unwavering. "It's the safest place I know, but it won't be easy to get to. We'll need to take back roads, avoid the highways. It's the only way we can make sure no one follows us." Emily nodded. She had no other choice. They had to take the risk. "Okay," she said, her voice steady. "Let's go." They packed up quickly, gathering what little they had left. Emily made sure to check out at the front desk, paying for their stay with the cash she had on hand. Then they loaded the SUV and drove off into the morning light. The air was crisp, and the roads were still empty at this hour. They kept their eyes on the rearview mirror, making sure no one was following them. For the first hour, the drive was relatively uneventful. They took small, winding back roads, avoiding the main highways and any major intersections. Emily's hands gripped the steering wheel, her mind constantly analyzing the surroundings, watching for any signs of trouble. Every car that passed made her heart race, and every turn seemed to take them further away from the life they had known. It was hard to believe that just a few days ago, she had been living a normal life, a quiet life. And now, here she was, running for her life with her children and a stranger she barely knew. Emily tried to push the thoughts aside. She couldn't afford to dwell on the past. She had to focus on the present, on keeping her family safe. After a while, the familiar roads faded away, and they found themselves deep in the countryside. The landscape was different now, the open fields and forests stretching out on either side. Grant had given her instructions on where to turn, and they followed them as best they could. But as the day wore on, Emily began to feel the weight of their situation more acutely. She had no idea how long they could stay hidden. And even if they managed to reach the cabin, what then? What were they going to do when the danger caught up with them? They couldn't keep running forever. Emily glanced over at Grant, who had been quiet for the past hour. "Grant," she said softly, trying to break the silence. "When we get to the cabin, what then? What's our next step?" Grant turned his head slightly, his eyes meeting hers. "We lay low," he said, his voice calm but tinged with an edge of urgency. "We stay out of sight. We don't contact anyone. We wait until we know it's safe to move again." Emily didn't like the sound of that. Wait? How long are we supposed to wait? Grant didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked out the window, his face hardening. "Until I can figure out who's behind all of this," he said quietly. "Until I know who we're really up against." Emily nodded, though the uncertainty gnawed at her. How long would they have to hide? What if they were never safe? She couldn't let her mind spiral into hopelessness. She had to stay strong for her children. And for Grant. They kept driving through the afternoon, the miles stretching on with no end in sight. Finally, as dusk began to fall, Grant told her to take a sharp turn onto a gravel road that led deeper into the forest. The trees closed in on either side, and the air seemed cooler, heavier. It was hard to imagine that such a peaceful place could be the setting for the chaos they were now living through. But they had arrived. The cabin was small, tucked away in a clearing, far from the nearest road. It was old but sturdy, and the porch was covered in a layer of dust and leaves. Grant stepped out of the car first, his eyes scanning the area. "This is it," he said, his voice softer now. "We'll be safe here for a while." Emily took a deep breath, her heart still racing, but she forced a smile. "Let's make it work," she said, her voice resolute. They unloaded the car and made their way into the cabin, the weight of their journey settling heavily on their shoulders. They had no idea what the future held, but for now, this would have to be enough. They were safe. For now. The cabin, though rustic, was a welcome refuge after the relentless driving and fear that had clung to them for days. Emily took a deep breath as she stepped inside, letting the stillness of the place wash over her. The air smelled of wood and earth, the scent of pine from the surrounding forest seeping through the cracks in the old windows. It was small, only a living room, a kitchen, and a single bedroom with a battered, yet functional bed, but it was enough. For now, it was all they had. Emily closed the door behind her, her hand lingering on the knob for a moment. She turned to Grant, who had already begun to inspect the place, his eyes darting around the room, taking in every detail. "It's not much," she said, trying to lighten the mood, though her voice carried the weight of their situation. "But it'll do for now." Grant nodded, but his eyes were far from reassured. "We'll be safe here for a while," he said, his voice low. "It's secluded, and no one knows about this place." Emily set the bags down on the floor, taking a moment to glance around. The walls were lined with old bookshelves filled with dusty volumes, and a small fireplace sat at the far end of the room. The furniture was worn but comfortable, the kind of place that had been forgotten by time. "We'll need to make a plan," Emily said, as she moved to the small table by the window, her mind racing. She had no illusions that they could just wait this out. Grant's enemies, whoever they were, would eventually find them, and she couldn't stay hidden forever. Grant walked over to her, his face tense as he sat down at the table. "I know," he said, rubbing his eyes as though to clear the exhaustion that had settled over him. "I've been trying to think of what we can do, but it's hard to think straight. We're not exactly in a position to call for help." Emily nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. "We don't have many options," she said, her voice steady but with an edge of frustration creeping in. "But I have to know what happened. Who's behind all of this?" Grant sighed, his eyes dark with the weight of unspoken truths. "It's not something I can easily explain," he said, looking away as if the very words pained him. "There are people I got involved with. People who don't care about anything but money and power. And I got caught in the middle." He paused, the guilt evident in his voice. "I thought I could control the situation, but I was wrong. And now, they're after me. And anyone who helped me." Emily leaned forward, her gaze fixed on him, trying to make sense of the pieces he was giving her. "But why bury you alive?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why not just kill you outright?" Grant's jaw clenched, his face hardening. "Because they wanted to send a message," he said slowly. "A warning to anyone who would cross them. They thought burying me would break me, but it didn't. It only made me stronger. And now, they want to finish the job." Emily's heart tightened at his words, but she couldn't let herself be consumed by pity or fear. "So, what do we do now?" she asked, her voice firm, despite the anxiety gnawing at her. Grant was silent for a moment, his brow furrowed as he thought. "We keep moving," he said finally. "We don't stay in one place for too long. We can't trust anyone, not yet. We need to figure out who's really after me, and why. Until we do, we're going to have to stay hidden." Emily nodded, trying to digest everything he had said. She had expected some answers, but now that she had them, it felt like even more questions had opened up. She could hear the crackling of the fire in the corner, the sound oddly comforting in the midst of the tension that filled the room. "We'll need food," she said, her mind already racing through what they could use. I can head into town tomorrow. Get supplies. Grant shook his head. It's too dangerous. The moment you step out there, someone could recognize you. We can't take that risk. Emily's heart sank, but she knew he was right. Then what do we do? She asked, her voice small, but determined. Grant paused, thinking. There's a store not far from here, he said slowly, his gaze shifting to the window, as if he was weighing the options. I used to go there when I needed things. It's not much, but it's a place where we can get what we need without drawing attention. But it's risky. I'll go, and you stay here with the kids. Emily frowned. I can't just stay here while you go out there. Grant gave her a hard look, his voice low and serious. I'm the one they're after, not you. Stay here. Keep the kids safe. I'll be quick. Emily wanted to argue, to refuse, but she could see the resolve in his eyes. She had to trust him. She had no other choice. Fine, she said quietly, her hands trembling slightly as she picked up the bags to start unpacking. But you better be careful. Grant gave her a small, tight-lipped smile. I will, he said before turning to the door. Emily watched him leave, her heart heavy in her chest. The door clicked shut behind him, and the sound of his footsteps fading into the quiet night was all she could hear for a long moment. Alone in the cabin, Emily felt the weight of the world on her shoulders. They were far from safety, and the road ahead was uncertain. But for the first time in a long time, she felt a flicker of hope. They could survive this. They had to. With that thought, she turned to the small kitchen, beginning to make dinner. She needed something to distract herself, something to focus on other than the terrifying unknown that loomed just outside the cabin. The silence in the room was deafening, but it gave her the clarity she needed. Whatever came next, she would face it head-on. She had to. For her children. For Grant. For herself. Emily sat by the small kitchen table, the faint sound of the wind rustling the trees outside the cabin, the only noise in the otherwise quiet room. The fire crackled softly in the corner, casting a warm, golden glow on the walls. It had been a few hours since Grant had left, and Emily found herself growing more anxious by the minute. The stillness was unnerving. The silence felt heavy, a constant reminder of the danger that still lurked in the world beyond their cabin. She glanced over at the children, who were playing quietly in the corner of the room, their innocence a stark contrast to the chaos they had been thrown into. Emily's heart clenched at the thought of them. They were safe for now, but how long could she keep them safe? How long before the people who were after Grant found them? Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the door creaking open. Emily's heart skipped a beat. As she stood up quickly, her breath catching in her throat. Grant stepped inside, looking tired but unharmed. He was carrying a small bag with supplies, and though he was clearly exhausted, there was a sense of relief in his eyes. You're back, Emily said, her voice shaking slightly with relief. I was starting to get worried. Grant gave her a tight smile as he closed the door behind him and locked it. I told you I'd be quick, he said, though his tone was strained. We need to move. It's not safe here for long. Emily's stomach tightened at his words. What happened? Did you get everything? Grant nodded, placing the bag on the table. I got what we needed. Food, some medicine, a few more things to keep us going. He paused, his face clouding with concern. But we have to keep moving. They're looking for us. I can feel it. Emily's heart sank as she sat back down at the table. Who are they? Why is this happening? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Grant sighed heavily, rubbing his face as if the weight of the world was bearing down on him. They're not just some random criminals, he said, his voice low. They're connected to powerful people. People who don't care about lives, just about control, power, and money. They'll stop at nothing to get what they want. Emily's mind raced. She had known the situation was dangerous, but hearing the gravity of it from Grant made it all feel even more real. So what do we do now? She asked, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and determination. We can't just keep running forever. Grant looked at her, his expression somber. We don't have much of a choice, he said, his voice steady but full of an underlying tension. But we need to figure out who's behind this. We need to know who we're dealing with before we make our next move. But for now, we stay hidden. Lay low. Emily nodded, understanding the urgency. She glanced over at the children, who were still playing quietly, unaware of the danger surrounding them. We'll keep them safe, she said firmly. I won't let anything happen to them. Grant gave her a small, approving nod. We have to stick together, he said. And trust each other. The moment we start splitting up or making mistakes, that's when we'll get caught. The tension in the room was palpable. Emily took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. I know, she said. I'll stay here with the kids. You can go out again, but please, be careful. We can't afford to make a mistake. Grant stood up and grabbed the bag he had brought in, pulling out the supplies one by one: canned food, bottled water, a first aid kit, and a few other essentials. He started organizing them on the table, his movements quick but deliberate. We'll need to get out of here soon, he said. The longer we stay, the more likely it is someone will find us. Emily watched him, her mind still reeling from the information he had shared. She knew Grant was right. They couldn't stay hidden forever, and every moment they spent in the cabin felt like a ticking clock counting down to the inevitable. How much time do we have? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Grant paused, glancing out the window for a moment before turning back to her. A few days, maybe less, he said, his tone grave. We need to figure out our next move quickly. But first, we need to find out who's behind all of this. Who they're really after. Emily nodded, her mind racing. I'll help however I can, she said. But we need to keep the kids safe. They can't get involved in any of this. Grant's gaze softened as he looked at her. I know. We'll do whatever it takes to protect them. Emily stood up, moving toward the children. They were still absorbed in their game, their laughter filling the room, oblivious to the weight of the situation around them. She felt a lump form in her throat as she watched them. She had always tried to protect them from harm, but now she had no choice but to involve them in this dangerous world. We'll get through this, she whispered to herself. We have to. Grant turned to face her as he grabbed a jacket and slipped it on. I'm going to check the perimeter, he said. Make sure we're still safe here. Emily nodded, even though her heart was heavy with fear. I'll be here. Keep them safe. As Grant walked out the door, Emily's gaze followed him. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time. Every moment they stayed in the cabin, the closer they came to being found. But she wasn't going to give up. She couldn't. She had to protect her children. She had to protect all of them. For the first time in days, Emily felt a flicker of hope, however faint, that they could survive this. She wasn't alone. She had Grant, and together, they would fight to make it through. The wind howled outside, and the trees swayed, but inside the cabin, Emily stood firm, determined to make it through whatever came next. The hours passed slowly as Emily sat in the cabin, her mind whirling with the weight of everything that had happened. She had been doing her best to keep the children calm, distracting them with small games and stories, but inside, her thoughts were consumed with fear and uncertainty. Grant had gone out again to check the area around the cabin. He had been gone for nearly an hour now, and Emily was beginning to feel the unease settle back in. Every creak of the wooden floor, every gust of wind outside, made her tense. The quiet felt heavier than ever. She stood up, glancing over at the kids, who were still playing quietly in the corner. Lily, her daughter, looked up and smiled at her, that bright, innocent smile that made Emily's heart ache with the need to protect her. Emily forced a smile back, though it didn't reach her eyes. She could feel the walls closing in. She had promised herself she wouldn't let fear control her, but it was hard. The days of running and hiding were taking their toll. She just wanted to know what came next. How much longer could they stay in this cabin before the danger found them? Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps outside, heavy and deliberate. She froze, her heart skipping a beat. Was it Grant? No, the footsteps were too heavy, too uneven. Emily quickly moved toward the window, pulling back the curtain just a fraction, her breath catching in her throat. Two figures were walking toward the cabin. They were far enough away that she couldn't make out their faces, but she could see the way they moved, slow, deliberate, as though they were searching for something, or someone. Her mind raced. It could be anyone. It could be the people after Grant. Or it could just be a couple of travelers passing by. But Emily didn't want to take any chances. She quickly moved to the door, locking it behind her and checking that all the windows were secured. She had to keep the children safe. She had to keep them away from whatever was outside. Her heart was pounding as she turned to the kids. Stay quiet, okay? She said, her voice low but firm. Just stay here and don't make a sound. Lily looked up at her with wide eyes, sensing the seriousness in her tone, but she didn't ask any questions. Emily was grateful for that. She didn't have time to explain. She turned back to the door, her ears straining to hear any sign of movement outside. The footsteps had stopped, but she couldn't shake the feeling that they were getting closer. Was it them? Were the people after Grant finally here? Or was it something else? She wasn't sure, but she had to be ready. Slowly, she moved to the corner of the room, out of sight of the windows and door, her eyes scanning every shadow for movement. She couldn't afford to be caught off guard. The seconds stretched into minutes, but still, there was no sound from outside. Just when she thought the danger might have passed, she heard the knock. It was soft at first, barely audible, but there was no mistaking it. Someone was at the door. Emily's heart pounded in her chest. She didn't know who it was, but she couldn't take the risk of answering. Not with the kids inside. Not with Grant still out there. She stayed perfectly still, her eyes on the door, her breath shallow as she waited. The knock came again, a little louder this time, followed by the sound of a voice calling through the door. "Hello? We know you're in there. Open up." Emily froze, her mind racing. She didn't recognize the voice. It could be anyone. "Open the door, or we'll come in." The voice continued, its tone growing more insistent. Emily's mind spun. Who were they? What did they want? Were they looking for Grant? Or were they just random strangers? She had no way of knowing, but she wasn't going to take any chances. Slowly, she backed away from the door, moving further into the room. She had to think fast. There was no way she could stay hidden forever. But if she opened the door, there was a chance they'd find out exactly who she was, who Grant was. The knock came again, harder this time, and the voice raised in volume. "We know you're in there. Open the door, or we'll break it down." Emily's heart was pounding, her hands shaking. She needed to do something. She couldn't just wait here. She glanced around, her eyes scanning the cabin for anything that might help. There was no time to plan a proper escape, but there was one option. She could try to escape out the back. It wasn't a perfect plan, but it was the only one she had. Emily moved toward the back door, trying to be as quiet as possible. She paused for a moment, listening to the growing urgency of the knocks at the front door. Whoever they weren't going to wait much longer. She had to act. She slowly opened the back door, the cool air hitting her face as she stepped outside, trying not to make a sound. She looked around quickly, scanning the area for any sign of movement. The forest behind the cabin was quiet, but she knew it wouldn't stay that way for long. She glanced back toward the door. She couldn't leave without Grant, and she couldn't leave the children inside, either. She had to get them out of there. Emily took one last look at the kids, still huddled together in the corner, their faces filled with confusion and fear. She had to stay calm. She had to protect them. She reached into her pocket for her phone, quickly dialing Grant's number. It rang, then went to voicemail. She cursed under her breath. Where was he? Was he okay? She couldn't wait any longer. She couldn't take the risk. Emily turned back to the back door, the sound of the front door being banged on louder now. They were getting closer. She had to move fast. With one last glance at the kids, she quickly left through the back door, her heart pounding in her chest as she disappeared into the trees, praying Grant would be okay and that she wasn't making the biggest mistake of her life. Emily moved swiftly through the woods, her breath quick and shallow as the branches scraped against her arms. She couldn't believe what she had just done, leaving the cabin, leaving her children behind, but there was no other choice. The sound of the knocking at the door still echoed in her mind, and she knew the danger was real. Whoever was outside wasn't going to leave them alone. She had to find Grant. She had to get them out of there, together. She pushed the fear down, focusing on her steps, on staying as quiet as possible. The cool evening air was sharp against her skin, but it did little to calm the storm brewing inside her. What if she made the wrong decision? What if Grant came back and couldn't find her? What if the people outside the cabin had already found her children? Every step she took, she felt the weight of that question pressing down on her. The path through the trees wasn't clear, and she had to slow down, carefully navigating the underbrush. The darkness was creeping in, and her surroundings felt unfamiliar, the forest closing in around her. She strained her ears for any sign of movement, any sound of footsteps, but the woods were quiet, eerily so. Emily's heart pounded in her chest, and the thought of her children left behind made her stomach churn. They were safe for now, she reminded herself. She had told them to stay quiet, to hide. But how long could they stay that way? She couldn't risk it. They couldn't stay in one place. Not with people like that looking for them. She was almost out of the woods when she heard it. the sound of footsteps behind her. Her heart leaped into her throat, and she spun around, instinctively reaching for the knife she had tucked into her belt. Her breath caught in her throat when she saw the figure emerging from the trees. It was Grant. He was breathing hard, his face pale, but he was unharmed. Relief flooded through Emily, her legs almost giving way as she ran to him. "Grant," she gasped, her voice shaking. "Thank God. I thought—" "Shoo," Grant interrupted, his eyes scanning the area quickly. He grabbed her by the arm, pulling her into the cover of the trees. "I saw them," he said, his voice tense. "They're getting closer. We need to move, now." Emily felt her blood run cold. The people who were after him, after them, had found them. She could see the determination in his eyes, and for a brief moment, she was torn between fear and trust. She had made the right choice leaving the cabin, hadn't she? But now, everything was moving faster than she could process. Grant's grip on her arm tightened, pulling her away from the spot where she had stopped. "We can't waste time," he urged, his voice low. "They'll be expecting us to head south. But we're not going that way." Emily didn't have to ask why. She knew they had to go in the opposite direction, away from the trail they had followed so far. They had to stay ahead of whoever was pursuing them. They couldn't let them catch up. Emily nodded, trying to focus, trying to push her panic aside. They ran through the trees, their feet crunching on the fallen leaves as they made their way through the thickening forest. She could hear the rush of her heartbeat in her ears, could feel the weight of the fear in her chest. How long could they keep running? How long before they were cornered? The path grew steeper as they ascended a small hill, and Emily stumbled, nearly losing her footing. Grant caught her, steadying her, his eyes narrowing as he looked ahead. "We need to find shelter," he said quickly. "I know a place. Just a little further." Emily didn't argue. She trusted him, even if everything was happening so fast that she couldn't keep up with the reality of it all. They reached a small clearing, and Grant stopped, looking around before pulling Emily toward a nearby cave. The entrance was hidden by a thick wall of vines, almost invisible unless you knew where to look. It was dark inside, but it offered some cover. They both crouched down inside the small, rocky shelter, breathing heavily. Emily leaned against the cold stone, her mind still racing. "How did you know they were close?" she asked, her voice shaking slightly. Grant looked at her, his expression hardening. "I saw them," he said, his voice tight. "They were moving through the woods. 2 of them. But there's more out there. I'm sure of it." Emily nodded, her heart sinking. "So we're trapped." Grant didn't answer right away, his eyes scanning the dark entrance to the cave. He was thinking, planning, but Emily could see the strain in his face. He was just as tired, just as terrified as she was. He just hit it better. "Not yet," he finally said. "We can't stay here for long. But we'll wait for now. They'll come through the path soon, and we need to be ready." Emily swallowed hard, trying to steady herself. She glanced back at the kids, who were still at the cabin, waiting for her return. The guilt hit her again, sharp and painful. She had left them. She had abandoned them. But she had no choice. She couldn't risk their safety by staying. "How long before they catch up?" she asked quietly. Grant didn't answer right away, but she could see the doubt in his eyes. "They're close," he said finally. "Very close. But I know a way out of here." Emily turned to him, her eyes filled with desperation. "You don't have much time." He nodded, his jaw clenched. "We need to get moving." With that, they stood up, ready to move again, knowing that the road ahead was uncertain. Emily could feel her heart racing, but she knew there was no turning back. Whatever happened next, she had to face it. For her children, for Grant, for herself. The night had fallen, and the darkness around them felt suffocating, a constant reminder of how fragile their situation was. Emily's mind was reeling as she followed Grant deeper into the woods. The faint light from the stars above was the only guide they had, but the trees were so thick that they barely made a difference. They were moving quickly, but quietly, trying not to make a sound as the woods seemed to close in around them. Emily's thoughts were a whirlwind, torn between the fear of what lay ahead and the nagging guilt of leaving the children behind. The image of Lily's confused face, the way she had looked up at her just before she left, haunted her. What if they didn't make it back in time? What if it was too late? She pushed those thoughts aside, focusing on Grant's every movement. He had taken the lead, his eyes constantly scanning the path ahead of them. He was a man on the run, a man who had lived through more than anyone should have to. And yet he carried the weight of all of it in the quiet determination of his actions. Emily had to trust him. But the truth was, she didn't know where they were going or what came next. All she knew was that they couldn't stay still. She couldn't stay still. The sound of a branch snapping underfoot made Emily freeze. Her heart jumped into her throat as she looked at Grant, who immediately put a finger to his lips, signaling her to stay quiet. He motioned for her to stay close as he crouched low to the ground. Emily did the same, her breath shallow as she tried to listen. She could hear nothing except for the rustling of leaves in the wind, but her instincts screamed that they were not alone. For several long moments, there was nothing but silence, but the tension in the air was unbearable. Grant's eyes never left the darkened woods around them. Emily couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching them, and her skin prickled with unease. Then she heard it, a faint sound, a whisper of movement coming from the direction they had just passed. Her heart hammered in her chest. Were they being followed? She looked to Grant for guidance, but his expression was unreadable, his focus fixed ahead. After a long beat, he stood slowly, his hand gripping the edge of his jacket as he scanned the surroundings once more. He motioned for Emily to follow him. "Keep close," he whispered, his voice low but urgent. Emily nodded, staying just a step behind as they moved forward again, now even more cautiously. Each step felt like it was leading them further into the unknown. The woods seemed endless, stretching on, and every rustle of the leaves made Emily's heart race faster. She tried to keep her mind clear, but all she could think about was the children back at the cabin. Had they been found? Was anyone coming for them? The thought of them alone, vulnerable, made her stomach turn with guilt. She had made a choice, but it didn't feel like the right one. They continued through the woods, every noise amplified in the tense silence. The weight of time pressing on her was unbearable, and Emily could feel her anxiety building with every passing moment. How much longer would they be safe out here? How long before the people hunting them found their trail? Finally, after what felt like hours of walking, they reached a small clearing. Grant stopped at the edge, peering through the trees. Emily caught up, her breath still ragged from the quick pace, but she noticed something in Grant's posture. His shoulders were tense, and his eyes were scanning the area with acute attention. "We need to stay here for a while," he said quietly. "They'll be looking for us in the woods soon. We can't keep moving until we know it's safe." Emily didn't argue. She understood. They needed to rest, but every part of her screamed that this wasn't enough. The danger was still looming. The unease in her gut hadn't faded, and she couldn't ignore the growing sense that they were running out of time. "How long do you think we have?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Grant's face darkened as he looked around the clearing. "Not much longer," he said, his voice tight. "We need to move quickly. There's a place, just a little further. We'll be able to hide for a while, but we have to make it there before they catch up." Emily nodded, trying to focus. "We'll make it. We have to." She wasn't sure if she believed her own words, but she couldn't afford to break down now. Not when everything was on the line. Not when her children were still out there, waiting for her. They took off again, this time more cautiously. Their pace slowed as they moved through the dense forest. The trees loomed around them like silent witnesses, but still, the feeling of being watched never left Emily. She couldn't shake the sensation that they were being tracked. Her mind wandered, but she didn't let herself dwell on it. The only thing that mattered was staying ahead, staying alive. After a while, Grant stopped again, motioning for her to follow him to a small ravine that seemed to be concealed by thick underbrush. It was deeper and darker than the clearing had been, and the heavy shadows of the trees seemed to swallow them whole. Emily followed him down, her heart pounding in her chest. She wanted to ask questions, to understand more of what was happening, but the reality of their situation was overwhelming. There would be time for answers later, if they even made it out of this alive. Grant stopped at the bottom of the ravine, his body tense as he crouched low. "We wait here," he said, his voice a whisper. "Just a few minutes. We can't afford to be seen." Emily crouched beside him, nodding as she surveyed their surroundings. The world felt like it was closing in around her. They couldn't stay in this place forever. They had to keep moving. But first, they needed to survive. Time passed, each minute feeling like an eternity. Emily couldn't help but feel the weight of the unknown hanging over them. How long would they have before the people chasing them caught up? She glanced at Grant, who was scanning the area, his face hard and determined. She didn't know if they would make it out of this. She didn't know if they would ever feel safe again. But she knew one thing. She wasn't going to stop fighting. She wasn't going to stop until she got her family to safety, no matter what it took. The stillness of the ravine stretched on, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. Emily crouched low, her breath steady but quick, as her eyes scanned the darkened forest around them. The weight of the silence pressed down on her chest, but it was the kind of silence that felt dangerous, the kind that came just before the storm. The thought of being trapped here, unable to move or breathe without risking being heard, filled her with dread. How much longer would they have before the people chasing them found their trail? How long before they would be forced to run again? She glanced over at Grant, his face expressionless, his eyes sharp as he peered through the trees. He hadn't said much since they had reached the ravine, his focus entirely on their surroundings. Emily knew he was just as restless as she was. The tension between them was palpable, and it was impossible to ignore the fear creeping up on her. They couldn't keep hiding forever. They had to make a move. But where? And how? Grant shifted beside her, his posture stiff, as he crouched even lower. He had been studying the path ahead, the lines of worry on his face deepening with each passing minute. "We can't stay here much longer," he said, his voice a whisper, barely audible over the sounds of the forest. "They're getting closer. I can feel it." Emily nodded, swallowing hard, trying to calm the knot in her stomach. "Then what do we do?" she asked, her voice strained, though she kept it low. "We need to move. But we can't risk getting caught." Grant didn't answer immediately. He scanned the area once more, his eyes narrowing as if searching for any sign of movement. Finally, he sighed, turning to her. "I know a place, a small cabin not too far from here. It's off the main roads, hidden away. It might be our best shot at staying ahead of them." Emily's heart skipped a beat. A cabin? Another hiding place? The idea of another small, isolated location made her uneasy, but she knew they didn't have many options left. It was either that or continue running aimlessly through the woods, never knowing where they were going. "We can make it," she said quietly, though her words were more to reassure herself than Grant. She glanced behind them, her eyes darting nervously through the trees. The thought of the children still haunting her, her heart breaking at the idea that they were left behind in such a dangerous world, only made her feel more desperate. "How far?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. Grant's eyes remained focused ahead. "Not far. Just a few miles. We'll need to move fast, though. No stopping." Emily nodded, her heart hammering in her chest. "Let's go," she said, her voice firm despite the fear rising within her. They moved quickly, pushing through the thick underbrush, the moonlight offering little help as they ventured deeper into the woods. Every step felt like a risk, every sound sending her pulse racing. It was as if the forest itself were conspiring against them, with every shadow and movement making her wonder if they were being followed. Grant led the way, his pace steady but cautious, while Emily stayed close behind, her senses heightened. The wind had picked up, rustling the leaves above them, and the cool night air sent shivers down her spine. She tried to keep her breathing steady, but it was hard. Every noise, every crack of a twig, made her flinch. They were moving further away from the ravine, heading toward the cabin Grant had mentioned. Emily wasn't sure what they'd find there, or how much time they would have before the people hunting them caught up. But she had no choice but to trust Grant. They kept moving, their steps slow and calculated. The hours seemed to stretch, but as they continued, Emily couldn't help but notice that the landscape was changing. The trees grew thicker, the air colder. Her muscles ached from the constant tension, but she kept going. She had no choice. As they rounded a bend in the path, Emily caught a glimpse of something up ahead. It was faint at first, just a silhouette against the backdrop of the trees. But then, as they got closer, she saw it more clearly. The cabin. It was small, tucked away in a secluded spot, almost invisible to anyone who wasn't looking for it. Emily felt a wave of relief wash over her. They had made it. But it was a fleeting relief, replaced quickly by the nagging fear of what was to come. Grant stopped just short of the cabin, turning to look at her. "Stay here," he said, his voice urgent. "I'll check it out first. Make sure no one's been there." Emily didn't argue. She stood still, her heart pounding as she watched Grant slip into the shadows, his figure vanishing into the darkness. She could hear him moving around the cabin, his footsteps muffled by the dense underbrush. It felt like an eternity before he returned, his face grim. "It's clear," he said, his voice low. "We can go in." Emily exhaled, though the relief was short-lived. They were safe, but only for now. The cabin wasn't much, but it was shelter. It was a place to regroup, to rest. They needed a plan, but Emily didn't know where to begin. She followed Grant into the cabin, the door creaking slightly as she pushed it open. Inside, it was small, with just a few pieces of worn furniture, a wooden table, a couple of chairs, a bed pushed up against the far wall. The air smelled musty, but it was better than nothing. Grant closed the door behind them, locking it tightly. "We'll stay here for a bit," he said, his voice steady but his eyes still scanning the area. "We need to rest, but we can't stay for too long. They'll be looking for us." Emily nodded, looking around the small cabin. It wasn't much, but it was a place to hide, a place to catch their breath. It wasn't the end of their journey, but for now, it was a brief moment of safety. She took a deep breath and sat down, the weight of everything pressing down on her. They had made it here, but the real test was just beginning. They had to stay ahead, stay hidden, and somehow survive. She didn't know how long they had until the danger caught up with them, but she knew one thing. They couldn't stop running yet. Not until they were safe. Not until they were free. The cabin was cold, a chill creeping through the walls despite the small fire crackling in the corner. Emily sat on the edge of the bed, her mind unable to rest. She could hear Grant moving around the cabin, the sound of his boots against the wooden floor echoing in the silence. It had been hours since they had arrived, but sleep felt impossible. Every sound outside seemed to be amplified, every shadow moving in the corner of her eye a potential threat. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, even here, in the middle of nowhere. The night had been long and filled with tense moments, and despite the shelter of the cabin, she knew they weren't safe yet. She glanced at the window, the darkened forest just beyond, and a cold shiver ran down her spine. They couldn't stay here forever. They couldn't afford to. "Grant," she called out softly, her voice quiet in the stillness. He paused, and she could hear him moving toward her. He stopped just inside the room, his silhouette framed by the dim light from the fire. His face was hard, the lines of exhaustion etched deep into his features. "Yeah," he asked, his voice low. "What is it?" Emily hesitated for a moment, then sighed. "I can't stop thinking about the kids." Grant's expression softened for a moment before he nodded. "I know. We'll get them out of here. We just have to be smart about it. Right now, we have to stay put. We need a plan." Emily's eyes drifted to the window again, her chest tightening with anxiety. "How long until they come for us?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Grant didn't answer immediately. He stood there, staring at the fire, his eyes distant. Finally, he spoke. "They're getting closer. I can feel it." Emily swallowed hard, her heart sinking. "How do we stop them? How do we even get out of this?" Grant stepped closer, sitting down on the edge of the bed next to her. His gaze was intense, his jaw clenched. "We don't stop. We keep moving. We stay ahead of them. I know places. We'll keep hiding until we figure out who they are and how to take them down." Emily met his gaze, searching his eyes for something, some hint of the answers she needed. She didn't see them, but she could see the determination in his face. He wasn't going to give up, and neither could she. "I don't know how much longer we can keep this up," she said quietly, her hands shaking slightly. "I can't keep running, Grant. Not without the kids." Grant's eyes softened, and he placed a hand on her shoulder, offering what little comfort he could. "We'll get them," he said, his voice firm, though the weariness in his eyes was evident. "I won't let anything happen to them. We'll figure it out. But we have to stay smart." Emily nodded slowly, though doubt still clung to her heart. The silence between them stretched for a long moment. Finally, she spoke again. "I just don't know where to go anymore. Every place we've been, it's not safe." Grant looked at her, his expression thoughtful. "You're right," he said quietly. "It's not about the places anymore. It's about getting them to safety. We can't keep staying in one spot for too long. But I know people who can help. If we get to them, they'll protect us. But we have to move quickly." Emily felt a flicker of hope at his words, but it was quickly extinguished by the thought of what they were up against. The people hunting them weren't just ordinary criminals. They were powerful, dangerous, and relentless. How could they ever stay ahead of them? How could they possibly escape? Grant seemed to sense her doubt. He squeezed her shoulder. We've been through worse, Emily. We'll get through this. She looked at him, seeing the resolve in his eyes, and for the first time in what felt like days, she allowed herself to believe it. Okay, she said softly, her voice steady now. What's the plan? Grant exhaled slowly. We wait until morning. We'll head out at first light, keep our movements low. I know a safe house not too far from here. It's off the grid, so they won't find us easily. We'll rest there for a while, regroup, and figure out the next step. Emily nodded again, the weight of the plan settling in. She had to trust him. They had to keep moving, no matter how exhausting or dangerous it felt. The world outside their cabin felt more uncertain than ever, but she had no other choice. They had to survive. They had to protect the children. All right, she said, her voice firm, though her heart was still racing. Let's do it. Grant stood up, walking over to the door, checking the lock once again. He turned back to her, his face serious. Stay here. Keep the kids safe. I'll go out and check the perimeter one last time before we rest. We don't want to be caught off guard. Emily nodded, feeling a sense of unease tighten in her chest. Be careful, she said softly, her voice filled with concern. Grant gave her a quick nod before disappearing out the door. The cabin door clicked shut behind him, and Emily stood frozen for a moment, listening. The silence in the room felt deafening, and her mind wandered back to the children. What if Grant didn't come back? What if they were found before they could escape? A sudden noise from outside made her jump. Her heart slammed into her ribs as she rushed to the window, her breath catching in her throat. She couldn't see anything from this angle, but she could hear the faint rustling of footsteps. Her pulse quickened, and for a moment, she stood frozen, staring into the dark woods outside. What if they were here? What if this was the moment everything changed? Emily's hand gripped the windowsill tightly as she stared, her body tense, every nerve on edge. Then, a figure emerged from the darkness. It was Grant. He was back. She exhaled a shaky breath as he stepped back into view, his eyes scanning the area behind him. Emily rushed to open the door, her heart still racing. Grant looked at her, his expression grim but calm. We need to move. Now. His voice was steady, but Emily could see the tension in his shoulders. They had no time left. Without another word, she grabbed her things, and together, they slipped into the darkness of the woods once again. Their journey was far from over, but Emily knew one thing. For certain, they would keep fighting, no matter what came next. The forest seemed darker than before, the shadows deeper, as if the trees themselves were conspiring to keep them hidden. Emily's steps were careful, but her mind raced, constantly darting between the need to keep moving and the overwhelming fear that they were being watched. She could feel the weight of their journey in her legs, but it was the weight in her chest that felt unbearable. Her thoughts kept returning to the children. Where were they? Were they still safe back at the cabin? Had anyone found them yet? She couldn't afford to dwell on it, but the thoughts kept flooding her mind. Grant was moving ahead of her, his pace steady, but his expression was unreadable. Every now and then, he would glance over his shoulder, his eyes scanning the darkness behind them, the tension in his shoulders betraying his calm demeanor. Emily kept up with him, though her body felt like it was slowing down, the fatigue beginning to take its toll. She had to keep going. They didn't have a choice. They couldn't stop. The cold air nipped at her skin, but it wasn't enough to clear the fear swirling inside her. They had been on the move for hours, but there was no sign of the safe house that Grant had promised, no sign of a place where they could rest, where they could breathe for even a moment without the constant fear of being found. How much further? Emily finally asked, her voice tight, as she tried to keep the panic out of it. Grant didn't answer right away. He was still scanning the forest, his eyes searching for something that only he seemed to know. Not far, he said eventually. But we need to stay off the path. We can't risk being spotted. Emily nodded, but her legs felt like lead, and the world around her seemed to be closing in. Every noise, every whisper of movement in the trees made her heart race. She looked over at Grant, trying to gauge if he was as unsettled as she was, but he remained focused, unwavering. She knew he was holding it together for both of them. She had to do the same. They continued walking, the darkness growing deeper around them, the sense of isolation more pronounced with each step. Emily could feel the weight of the forest pressing in on them, the sense that they were no longer just running from danger, but that they were walking into it. She wished she knew what was coming next, but there was no way of knowing. All she could do was trust Grant. "We're close," Grant finally said, his voice low. "Stay close." They moved faster now, the urgency in his voice making Emily's pulse quicken. She followed him without hesitation, each step a mix of fear and hope. They were close to the safe house. They had to be. After what felt like an eternity, the trees finally started to thin, and Emily saw the first signs of a structure up ahead. The outline of a building, barely visible in the dark, came into focus. Her heart skipped a beat as they moved toward it. The safe house was small, just a cabin, but it was a relief to see it. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. Grant led her to the door, pushing it open with a creak. They slipped inside, and Grant immediately went to secure the entrance, checking the locks and windows. Emily leaned against the wall, her breath still shaky as she tried to calm herself. The sound of the wind outside howled through the trees, but here, inside, it was quiet. For a moment, it almost felt like they were safe. But Emily knew better. They couldn't let their guard down yet. "You okay?" Grant asked, his voice low as he approached her. Emily nodded, though she knew her expression betrayed her. Her mind was still racing, the fear of being found, the worry about the kids. She couldn't stop thinking about them. "I'm fine," she said, forcing a calmness into her voice. "What now?" Grant ran a hand through his hair, his face dark with the weight of their situation. "We rest for a bit," he said. "Just a few hours. We've made it this far, but we can't afford to stay long. They'll be looking for us." Emily nodded, but she couldn't shake the feeling that they were being hunted. Every noise in the cabin, every creak of the floorboards, made her jump. How long could they keep running? How long until they ran out of places to hide? The uncertainty of it all gnawed at her. Grant seemed to sense her unease. He stood, moving to the small table in the corner, where a few basic supplies were stacked. "We need to plan our next move," he said, his voice serious. "We can't stay in one place for too long. The longer we're here, the more likely it is that they'll catch up." Emily watched him as he moved around the cabin, gathering what they would need for the next leg of their journey. The safe house was small, but it was better than nothing. It would provide them with a chance to rest, to gather their strength, but it wouldn't be enough to keep them safe forever. "Do you think we'll make it out of this?" Emily asked, her voice almost a whisper, her fear spilling over despite her best efforts to control it. Grant paused, turning to look at her. For a moment, his eyes softened, and then he gave her a look that was equal parts reassurance and determination. "We're going to make it," he said firmly. "We don't have a choice. We'll keep moving, stay ahead of them. I won't let them get to you or the kids." His words, though spoken with conviction, did little to calm the storm inside her. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that they could outlast the danger, but every step they took felt like it was leading them closer to a cliff, and there was no guarantee they wouldn't fall off the edge. "But what happens when we run out of places to hide?" she asked quietly, the question that had been gnawing at her for days. Grant didn't answer right away, his gaze fixed on the supplies in front of him. Finally, he spoke, his voice calm but full of the hard edge of experience. "We make our stand," he said, "when we're ready. But for now, we keep running." Emily felt the weight of his words. She wanted to believe in him, wanted to believe in their chance to escape, but deep down, she knew that their fight wasn't over yet. They were still in the eye of the storm, and she wasn't sure how much longer they could hold on. But one thing was certain, she wasn't giving up. Not yet. Not ever. She wouldn't let them take her family. She wouldn't let them take everything she loved. For as long as she had breath in her lungs, she would fight to keep them safe. And so, despite the fear, despite the uncertainty, Emily stood tall, ready to face whatever came next. The silence in the cabin was deafening as Emily sat on the edge of the bed, her mind spinning. The small room felt more like a cage than a refuge now. They had arrived here seeking safety, a brief respite from the constant running, but now the walls seemed to close in around her. The weight of their situation pressed down on her chest. Grant had told her that they were close to their next destination, a place they could rest, regroup, and plan. But how long would it take before they ran out of places to hide? How long before the people hunting them found them here, too? The questions gnawed at her, but she pushed them aside. She couldn't afford to lose focus now. Her thoughts turned to the children. Were they still safe? She couldn't shake the image of their innocent faces, their confusion and fear the last time she had seen them. She had promised herself that she would get them out of this alive, but the more she thought about it, the more uncertain that promise seemed. She stood up abruptly, the weight of the uncertainty too much to bear. She needed answers. She needed to know what came next. She glanced toward the door, hearing Grant's movements outside. He had been quiet since they arrived, his face hard with the burden of their situation, but he wasn't one to show weakness. He was plotting their next move, even if he hadn't shared all the details yet. Emily took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. She had to stay calm. She couldn't let fear control her. Not now. Not when everything was on the line. Her hand moved to the window, and she peered outside. The forest was still, the trees swaying slightly in the wind, but there was no sign of movement. No sign of the danger that had been lurking behind them. Yet, she turned back toward the room, her mind still racing, when she heard the sound of footsteps outside the door. She froze. For a moment, her heart skipped a beat. Was it them? Were they already here? The door creaked open slowly, and Emily's breath caught in her throat as she turned. Grant stepped inside, his expression unreadable. He didn't speak immediately, but his presence in the doorway was enough to tell her that something had changed. "What's happening?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Grant didn't answer right away. He crossed the room and stood beside her, his eyes scanning the outside world as if expecting someone to emerge from the shadows. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and tense. "We've been compromised," he said. Emily's stomach dropped. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice shaking now. Grant's eyes met hers, his expression grim. "I saw them. 2 men. They were watching the cabin from a distance." Emily's heart raced, and for a moment, she couldn't breathe. They were so close. Too close. "How long until they find us?" she asked, her voice cracking. Grant didn't answer immediately. He looked away, his jaw tight with frustration. "I don't know. But they're not alone. There's more of them out there." Emily's mind raced as she tried to process what he was saying. "What do we do now?" she asked, her heart pounding in her chest. Grant turned to face her, his gaze steely. "We don't stay here," he said firmly. "We can't risk them finding us. We have to leave. Now." Emily nodded, trying to steady her shaking hands. She didn't want to leave. Not like this. But she knew Grant was right. They couldn't stay here. The danger was too close. She grabbed her bag, slinging it over her shoulder as Grant moved toward the door, his eyes scanning the surroundings one last time. "Where do we go?" she asked as they stepped out into the night. "There's a place," Grant said, his voice low and urgent. "It's a safe house. Not far from here. We'll lay low until we figure out what to do next." Emily nodded, following him into the darkness. She didn't know where they were going, but she trusted Grant. She had to. They walked through the woods, their footsteps muffled by the thick carpet of leaves beneath their feet. Emily could hear the sound of her own breath, the rhythm of her heart hammering in her chest as they moved deeper into the forest. The air was cold, and the night felt heavy, as if the entire world was holding its breath. She glanced at Grant, who was moving with purpose, his face hard, eyes focused ahead. She knew he was leading them to safety, but a nagging feeling lingered in the back of her mind. How much longer could they keep running? They couldn't stay hidden forever. The forest seemed endless, but as they walked, Emily noticed the shift in the air. The tension around them grew, thicker with every step. The silence of the woods felt like a threat now, the quiet stretching in all directions, but they kept moving, driven by the knowledge that stopping was not an option. After what felt like an eternity, they reached a small clearing. In the center was a dilapidated building, barely visible in the darkness. It looked abandoned, but it was the kind of place that could offer them shelter, even if only temporarily. "This is it," Grant said, his voice low as he looked at the building. Emily glanced around, still uneasy. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching them. But for now, it was their only option. They moved quickly toward the building, the sound of their footsteps echoing in the still night. As they reached the door, Grant pushed it open, revealing a dark, dusty room. "Stay close," he said, as Emily stepped inside. The air was thick with dust, and the floor creaked beneath their feet. They couldn't afford to relax. Not yet. The danger was still out there, and Emily knew that the next move could determine everything. She glanced at Grant, whose eyes were still scanning the area, alert for any signs of trouble. He was a man on edge, and she couldn't blame him. They had made it this far, but they weren't safe yet. They couldn't stop now. "We wait here," Grant said, his voice firm. "For now we rest. But we don't stay long. They're coming, and we need to be ready." Emily nodded, though her stomach churned with unease. She didn't know how much longer they could keep running, but one thing was certain. She would keep fighting. She would keep going. For her children. For herself. And for Grant. The storm wasn't over yet, but she wasn't about to give up. Not now. Not ever. The room was dim, with only the faintest hint of moonlight seeping through cracks in the boarded-up windows. The air was heavy with the scent of dust and old wood, but it was the stillness that made Emily feel like the walls were closing in around her. She sat in the far corner, her back against the cold wall, her eyes fixed on the dark doorway. Grant was sitting across the room, his face etched with exhaustion, but his eyes were sharp, constantly scanning for any sign of movement. Despite the brief moment of respite they had found in this isolated cabin, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time. The uncertainty gnawed at her. They had come here to rest, but it wasn't really rest. They were trapped in a moment that could collapse at any second. The quiet was oppressive, and it only deepened the sense of dread that had been building in her ever since they'd arrived. The danger that had been chasing them was closing in, and she could feel it like a storm on the horizon. She glanced at Grant, who was now staring into the distance, lost in thought. He had told her earlier that they couldn't stay here long, that they had to move as soon as the opportunity presented itself. It was just a matter of time. But where could they go? Every place they'd tried had been temporary, every safe house only a brief illusion of safety. Emily's thoughts returned to the kids. She couldn't stop thinking about them. Where were they now? Were they still okay? Would she ever see them again? She swallowed hard, pushing the painful thoughts away. She couldn't afford to break down, not now, not when everything was still so uncertain. She had to focus. She had to stay strong. She took a deep breath, her gaze lifting to meet Grant's. He was watching her, his eyes softening just a fraction. "We'll make it," he said quietly, his voice steady but filled with an undeniable resolve. Emily nodded slowly, though the doubt in her heart was still there, lingering like a shadow. She wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that they could escape the threat that hung over them. But every step they took seemed to lead them deeper into a world they couldn't control, a world where their every move was being watched. "What if they find us here?" Emily asked, her voice barely a whisper, as though speaking louder would make the danger real. "What if they're already here?" Grant stood, his movements slow, but deliberate. He went to the door and checked the locks again, his face unreadable as he did. Then he turned back to her. "We'll leave before they do," he said, his voice firm. "We can't afford to wait." He walked to the small table in the corner and picked up a map they had been studying earlier. "There's a place I know. It's remote, even more isolated than this. We'll have to move fast, but it's our best shot." Emily stood up, crossing the room to join him. Her eyes traced the lines on the map, and for the first time in a long time, she felt a flicker of hope. It was a small spark, but it was there. "How far is it?" she asked, her voice steady now. "A few days' travel if we take the back roads. It's risky, but we can make it if we're careful," Grant replied. Emily nodded again. They had no other choice. It wasn't like they could stay in this cabin, hoping for the best. They had to move. The thought of traveling for days, though, made her stomach twist. It meant more time on the run, more chances for them to be found. But it was their only option. "When do we leave?" Emily asked, her voice quiet but resolute. Grant looked at her for a long moment, his gaze unwavering. "As soon as possible. We'll rest tonight, but we leave at first light." Emily didn't say anything more. She couldn't. The truth was, the uncertainty was killing her. Every plan they made seemed to hinge on the same terrifying unknown. When, not if, they would be found. The hours passed slowly, the night dragging on with every creak of the old cabin and the sound of wind howling outside. The air was thick with tension, and even though she tried to sleep, every time she closed her eyes, the images of her children flashed through her mind. She couldn't rest. Not until they were all safe. And safety felt like something slipping further away the longer they stayed on the move. The next morning came too soon. The first rays of sunlight filtered through the cracks in the walls, casting long shadows on the floor. Emily woke up to find Grant already packing, his movements quick but methodical. The cabin felt colder now, more barren without the illusion of rest they had hoped for. Emily stood up, stretching stiffly. The cold had settled deep in her bones, and her mind was foggy with exhaustion. But there was no time to linger. They had to leave. She moved to gather what little they had left, the fear in her chest growing heavier with every passing moment. They couldn't stay here. She knew that. And yet, as she packed, the thought of leaving behind the tiny bit of safety they had found felt like an unbearable weight. The world outside was unknown, the threat looming larger with every step they took. Ready? Grant's voice broke her thoughts, and she turned to see him standing by the door, his backpack slung over his shoulder. She nodded, her resolve hardening. "Let's go," she said, her voice steady now. They walked out into the cold morning, the forest still and quiet around them. It was a moment of peace, but it was the calm before the storm. Emily's heart was in her throat as they moved deeper into the woods, but she couldn't stop now. They had to keep moving, keep running. For the children. For each other. She didn't know how long they could stay ahead of the people hunting them, but one thing was certain, they couldn't stop. Not yet. And so, they kept moving, step by step, into the unknown, knowing that no matter what came next, they would face it together. The journey was far from over, but Emily had found something she hadn't known she had left, hope. And with that hope, they would keep fighting. No matter what. In this gripping tale of survival, you'll dive deep into the world of millionaires forced to confront their darkest fears and hardest choices when danger strikes. The story follows Emily, a single mother, and Grant, a man with a mysterious past, as they race against time to escape deadly pursuers in a thrilling journey through the woods. Their quest for safety leads them from one hiding place to another, each more precarious than the last, as they fight to protect their loved ones and uncover secrets that could change everything. With each turn, the stakes get higher, and the fear of being found becomes more overwhelming. These millionaire stories show just how far people will go when survival is the only thing that matters. From moments of intense fear to glimmers of hope, the journey tests their limits. Emily's strength as a mother shines through as she faces unimaginable challenges, trying to keep her children safe in a world that feels increasingly dangerous. Meanwhile, Grant's troubled past is revealed, and his skills are put to the test as they navigate a series of close calls and narrow escapes. In a world where trust is scarce, these millionaire stories explore the bonds that form under pressure and the lengths people will go to for survival. As the story unfolds, the reader is taken on a suspense-filled ride, filled with twists and turns. Emily and Grant's determination to outwit those chasing them and protect their loved ones from danger will keep you on the edge of your seat. These millionaire stories paint a vivid picture of the raw emotions and complex decisions that come when everything is on the line. With every chapter, the urgency to escape builds, and the story hurtles toward an unforgettable conclusion. This thrilling adventure will captivate you as it explores what happens when survival instincts kick in, and ordinary people are forced to face the extraordinary. Through these millionaire stories, the resilience of the human spirit is put to the ultimate test as Emily and Grant fight not just for their survival, but for a chance at a future they can still control. Don't miss out on this heart-pounding journey that will leave you questioning the lengths you would go to in order to survive.